Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I am a military and naval historian. And you're here on week 4 of a multi-part series, which will take us to the end of the year, in which I go over the history of military thought, strategy, and tactics, and some of the weapons that were influenced the latter, former. Uh, this week here, we're going to discuss Clausewitz, Jomini, and their influence on how the U.S. Civil War came to be fought. So, with that, let's get into it. So, besides the Second World War, the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century have to be the most studied conflict in modern military history. During the nearly 20 years in which he actively commanded troops on the battlefield, Napoleon Bonaparte demonstrated that he was a master of the tactics used by armies during the 19th century. And he also improved on them. More than that, despite his eventual defeat at Waterloo and subsequent exile, Napoleon's military campaigns had became the basis of the two most important military strategists in history, men whose treatises are still required reading at every military academy, war college, and military history degree program. And that is, of course, uh, Clausewitz's On War and Jomini's The Art of War. So the Prussian Clausewitz and the Swiss Jomini were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Uh, Clausewitz had first enlisted in the Prussian army as an adolescent and would rise through the ranks to become a general by the time of his untimely death in 1831. He had fought on the front lines and had served as a staff officer in both the Prussian and Russian armies during the Napoleonic Wars. Jomini, who started his military career much later than Clausewitz, would serve with the Swiss, French, and Russian armies during the Napoleonic Wars as a staff officer, most notably as chief of staff to Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's principal lieutenants. But while both Jomini and Clausewitz wrote their treatises on military strategy based on their experiences during the Napoleonic Wars, they approached that topic in differing manners. Beginning with Jomini, his approach was practical, explaining the best tactics and formations for an army to use in the field to gain the best chance of winning. The majority of the examples he used were from his time on Marshal Ney's staff, this demonstrating how Napoleon would march his corps on numerous parallel routes covering a wide front and still effectively coordinate them to concentrate on the appointed battlefield with minutes of each formation's arrival. Further, Germany was focusing on explaining the best usage of the natural terrain to maximize the offensive power of the army or solidify its defensive lines. Clausewitz, on the other hand, took a philosophical approach in his treatise. To him, warfare was not just about fighting on the battlefield and the tactics to be employed. Armed conflict was a continuation of politics and diplomacy, or as one Jedi noted, negotiations with a lightsaber. Essentially, the use of an army in an armed conflict is a political act, not necessarily an act of aggression, and that military gains can and should be viewed as political gains, and the same for setbacks. Furthermore, Clausewitz urged his readers to be prepared for friction in warfare, as he realized that the best laid plans generally do not work upon engagement with enemy forces, and that there is always a fog of war that clouds the battlefield. This fog of war and friction will always exist, regardless of how detailed a battle plan is, and regardless of how many variables that planners take into consideration, according to Clausewitz. Unfortunately, Clausewitz died before he could finish and even edit his treatise, but thanks to his widow, his works were first published in 1835. On War quickly became required reading for Prussian officers and became the treatise that served as the backbone for the German military approach to its future wars. Additionally, after the Duke of Wellington's response to Clausewitz's analysis of the Battle of Waterloo, The latter's work came into circulation and popularity in the British Empire. Later, Mao and Lenin would refer to Clausewitz's writings as leaders of their respective communist regimes, and Eisenhower himself would base his approach to nuclear deterrence on this treatise. Jomini's The Art of War was written in 1854 as accumulation of the principal ideas that he had been writing about for 5 decades. By this time, Jomini was not only able to see the results of his earlier works played out on the battlefield, but adjusted his theories based on those real world observations. Most importantly, Jomini's writings made an impression on a young U.S. Army lieutenant, Dennis Hart Mahan, who began teaching military strategy at West Point in 1830 and made the Swiss theorist's writings mandatory reading. Jomini's ideas, as taught by Mahan and his successors at West Point, continue to serve as a theoretical foundation for the United States Army to this day, and would influence the most important maritime strategist in history, his son, Alfred Thayer Mahan. More importantly, Jomini's works, as taught by Mahan, was the foundation for the vast majority of the generals who led both sides of the American Civil War. And now I will make one note here that is most of the generals, Robert E. Lee actually predated and went to West Point at least a decade prior to Mahan's arrival. Shifting gear, among American history buffs and historians, the Civil War is clearly one of the most studied wars and eras of United States history. In university undergraduate and graduate history programs, there are entire courses each term that focus solely on that turbulent time. Within the field of military history, the American Civil War is debated and studied as one of the first truly modern wars, along with the Wars of German Unification, the Russo Japanese War, and the Second Boer War, to name a few. Now, this wasn't always the case, and until the end of the Cold War, most military historians argue that the First World War saw the beginning of modern warfare, but it's only been in these past few decades that that position has been generally abandoned and shifted to those numerous conflicts which occurred in the second half of the 19th century, starting with the American Civil War and the German wars, the Wars of German Unification. Like I said earlier, the application of Napoleonic tactics and strategies based on Jomini's writings as taught by Dennis Hart Mahan at West Point since 1830 was the foundation for generals on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. With all the generals basically working from the same Napoleonic playbook, these men would have to make full use of the developments in military technology since Waterloo to gain an advantage. The biggest of those innovations was the rifled musket and the mini ball used in those weapons. Uh, this here's a Springfield 1861, which was used by the Union Army, and by adding rifling to a musket like this, or a set of spiral grooves into the barrel of the musket, a fire shot was far more accurate than the previous century's smoothbore weapons. Instead of infantrymen hoping to hit anywhere on his target at 100 meters with a smoothbore musket, these rifled muskets could hit a target at ranges greater than 300 meters and with deadly effect. You combine that with the mini ball, which was conically shaped and designed to be used by these rifle muskets, as the wider end of the round was designed to expand when the powder charge was ignited to fit tightly into the rifling grooves upon it being fired and spin it on its horizontal axis. Now, the cavalry themselves also benefited by having access to a highly effective, quick reload carbine rifle that were being made in mass quantities, such as the Sharps rifle. A carbine rifle is essentially a shortened rifle that was more efficient for a cavalry trooper to use on horseback than the rifled muskets of the infantry, but still maintained most of the firepower of their larger cousins. Furthermore, the majority's carbine rifles were designed to be breech loading, as in you load the round in from the uh, close to where the firing pin is, instead of loading from the muzzle or the very end of the barrel, which made it both quicker and easier for a mounted trooper to use this in combat. Finally, uh, the final campaign of the Civil War saw the first deployments and use of the modern machine gun on the battlefield, with John Gatling's multiple barrel rotary fire device, the Gatling gun. And this was really put into use in the trenches around Petersburg, Virginia. And I should also note that this rotary barrel design is still in wide use in more modern forms, with many militaries, especially the United States, using it as a basis for its main aircraft cannon, as well as for the famous minigun. And also, during this time, we see some of the earliest use of what would become trench warfare tactics, and that was a natural development during the Civil War, as all these West Point trained officers, while fluent in Jomini's writings, also had it drilled into them as cadets that the first thing that their soldiers did when taking up a defensive position was to dig uh, protective uh, earthworks and trenches. In effect, this training to always dig in will accumulate in the defensive trench works as seen here at Petersburg and the winter long siege that occurred in 1864 1865. And it was not just trench warfare that developed close to this uh, modern form, but also guerrilla or irregular warfare, especially behind Confederate lines with raids on enemy on supply lines, the cutting down of telegraph poles, destruction of rail lines, and of course, I would have to say the general chaos that ensued on the Kansas Missouri border, which is a couple hours to my west, since 1854. Telegraphy and railroad transportation were also two key developments that Napoleon and his marshals could have dreamed of having. Railroads allowed both sides to quickly resupply their troops, evacuate wounded men from the front lines, and rapidly move reinforcements to where they were needed. I should note at going into the second battle of Bull Run or Manassas, depending on where you're at in the United States, Stonewall Jackson's troops were actually in the Shenandoah Valley. Is thanks to Manassas being a rail junction at that time that Longstreet would or Longstreet was, just marched up to Manassas, and then Stonewall Jackson put all his troops on trains, and they were there in a couple hours to join the fight and uh, lead to that second rout of the Union Army. Uh, and also that was also helpful in coordinated use to telegraphs, which also allowed the federal and Confederate governments in Washington D.C. and Richmond and Virginia, respectively, to have near constant communications with the far-flung armies and their field commanders. And towards the end of the war, Ulysses S. Grant himself actually had a riverboat under his command that all it was his headquarters, and most of that headquarters was an entire deck with dozens of telegraph operators and their equipment keeping tabs of all the various far-flung Union armies. And while all this technology was combined with the tactical training from West Point that the senior officers received uh, based on the works of Jomini, it's caused the Civil War to be especially violent and deadly. It is the latter that was still the foundation of the actions taken on the battlefield. However effective a commander was in battle is based on their efficient use of tactics, along with the ability to adapt to ever-changing friction that exists in conflict. The Civil War is chock full of good examples of good tacticians and commanders, and those that should have never been given command. There's a lively ongoing debate among military historians and history buffs of who was the best commander during the Civil War. Some argue it's Robert E. Lee, others for Stonewall Jackson, others for a bunch of other officers. Now, I will make the argument and convinced that the best general of the American Civil War was the one who still commanded an army at the end of the war, and as you let's just say, it's Grant. I should also note if you're going to want more further reading or more in-depth reading about the Civil War in general, I highly recommend the Pulitzer Prize-winning Battle Cry of Freedom from James McPherson. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the battlefield tactics, and used in the campaigns and battles, I this is out of while this is out of print, the Civil War Commander Strategy by Archer Jones is highly recommended and is also a very easy read too. And so, with that, thank you for watching. I hope you get to share this with someone that you know that will enjoy it. Also, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and like the video if you enjoyed it yourself. And if you opt to comment, please be kind to everyone. And with that, next week we will cover uh, the World Wars. And so until then, I will see you later. Bye bye.